New York City, or as it was known in 1647, New Amsterdam once had streets that told a story most history books skip over. A story written not in ink, but in waste, in hog manure, in the unbearable weight of a city choking on itself. What you're about to see is an AI reconstruction of that world, pieced together from historical records to bring you as close to the truth as the past will allow. Because in 1657, a man walking through those very streets described the smell of the air in just 3 words: impossible to breathe. But what truly stops you in your tracks isn't that detail alone. It's the question lurking behind it: who was actually responsible for this? The people living knee-deep in filth, or a government that saw it all and still chose to look the other way? Historical records and accounts from this period can be verified through sources like the New York City Municipal Archives, the Museum of the City of New York, or Kenneth T. Jackson's Encyclopedia of New York City institutions that hold the earliest urban memory of this continent. But before we go searching for answers to that question, we need to understand exactly how this disaster unfolded in the first place. The year was 1647. The place, a narrow strip of land at the southern tip of an island. The native Lenape people called Mannahatta, the island of many hills. The Dutch named it New Amsterdam, the capital of their New Netherland colony. And they came carrying dreams of commerce, carrying ships, carrying the promise of profit from fur and timber. But they also brought pigs, they brought horses, they brought cattle, and everything that comes with them. By the time Peter Stuyvesant, the newly appointed director of the Dutch West India Company, stepped onto this island on his famous wooden leg, he was walking into not a flourishing city, but a chaos that polite language could not begin to describe. The streets, if they could even be called streets, were tangled dirt lanes winding between crooked wooden houses. No drainage system, no public waste pits, no infrastructure of any kind that could be called urban sanitation. The only things that existed were people, livestock, and everything both left behind at the end of each day. Garbage was thrown straight out of windows onto the ground below. Hog manure, horse manure, cattle manure, piled up in heaps between the alleyways. In the summer, the stench rose so thick that people said even the birds avoided flying over the area. To put it in perspective, Victorian London, a century and a half later, would experience what became known as the Great Stink of 1858, when the smell rising off the Thames brought Parliament to a standstill. New Amsterdam in 1647 was already living its own version of that moment, smaller, more concentrated, and almost entirely forgotten. Then came June of 1647, and what had always been inevitable finally arrived. Peter Stuyvesant gave the order. On an official document stamped by the Dutch colonial authority, a decree was issued. The dumping of garbage, animal manure, and waste onto public streets was strictly forbidden. Violators would be fined. The ban would become one of the earliest urban sanitation laws ever enacted on the territory that would one day become the United States. And people celebrated it as a step forward for civilization. But stop right there. Put yourself in the position of a craftsman living in a small wooden house on Pearl Street. He wakes up every morning, tends to his one pig, the family's only source of meat through the winter, and then faces a question that no one in the government bothered to answer. Where exactly was that waste supposed to go? No collection vehicles, no designated dumping grounds, no guidance of any kind beyond the ban itself. This is what urban historians call a policy in the clouds. Regulations written from an official's desk that never once touched the reality of the ordinary person living down on the street. And it is precisely in that gap between the official document and the mud-soaked alley that a question begins to take shape. A question no one in that era dared to say out loud, but that anyone who has ever lived in similar circumstances has quietly thought to themselves: were the people truly without conscience? Or did they simply have no other choice? The story of New Amsterdam in 1647 is not a story of laziness or lack of civilization. Look more closely at the historical records that survive, and a far more complicated picture begins to emerge. The majority of New Amsterdam's residents at that time were people who had come searching for opportunity: craftsmen, small merchants, Dutch farmers, Walloons, Englishmen, and even enslaved Africans brought over by the Dutch West India Company. These were not people who set out to turn their city into a dump. They were people rebuilding their lives from scratch on an unfamiliar land, with no infrastructure, no support systems, and no one who actually took responsibility for organizing the urban space around them. But then something more interesting surfaces in the records. The Dutch West India Company, the organization that truly controlled New Amsterdam, was not a city government in any modern sense of the word. It was a trading corporation. Its sole objective was profit from fur and commerce. Investing in sanitation infrastructure, building a waste collection system, those were expenses that cut into the balance sheet. They were never part of the plan. Here's the twist. The waste ban of 1647 was not the sign of a government trying to protect its people. It was the reaction of a corporation trying to protect its image and control its costs without spending a single extra coin to actually solve the problem. The people were banned from dumping their waste, but no one gave them anywhere else to put it. The real question is not why New Amsterdam was filthy. The real question is why that filth was allowed to go on long enough to force the government's hand, and why, when they finally acted, the response was to place the burden on the people rather than address the root cause. Urban historians have a term for this: displacement of blame. It describes the moment when a systemic problem is repackaged as a problem of individual behavior. When a city has no waste collection system, but instead of building one, the authorities write laws to fine the very people who have nowhere to put their garbage. That is displacement of blame in its purest form. And this was not the first time. It would not be the last. What do we know about modern cities? Low-income neighborhoods in major urban centers are chronically underserved by waste collection. When pollution takes hold, the first response is almost always a fine, not an investment in infrastructure. The poor get labeled as dirty, while the reality is that they are living in conditions the government has refused to improve. The distance between New Amsterdam in 1647 and certain neighborhoods in an Asian or African city in 2024 may not be as wide as we would like to believe. But the more uncomfortable truth is still waiting just ahead. Peter Stuyvesant is the name history tends to remember fondly, the strict but effective director who brought order to a chaotic colony, the man credited with laying the foundations of modern New York. The waste ban of 1647 is routinely held up as evidence of that progress. But Stuyvesant did not build a single waste collection system. He did not establish a single public dumping ground. He did not deploy a single worker to clean the streets. The only thing he did was write the ban and collect fines from people who had no real way of complying with it. And that is the true emotional core of this story, not the stench rising off the streets of New Amsterdam in 1647, but the quiet injustice dressed up in the language of civilization and order. The poor, the craftsmen, the enslaved, the landless were punished for a problem that the very system they lived under had created for them. And when history finally sat down to remember what happened, it remembered the man who signed the paper, not the people who paid the price for it. New Amsterdam in 1647 was not alone. It was not an exception in the history of urban civilization. London, Paris, Amsterdam, Rome. Every major city in the world before the 19th century lived through its own version of this story. Garbage in the streets was not a Dutch problem. It was not a colonial American problem. It was the universal consequence of urbanization, outpacing the infrastructure built to support it. And in nearly every single case, The government's first response was almost always the same. Blame the people first. Build the system later, sometimes decades later, sometimes centuries later. London had to wait until 1858, until the Great Stink made it physically impossible for Parliament to remain in session, before it finally began constructing a modern underground sewer system. More than 200 years after the first bans were issued, the real infrastructure finally arrived. Paris followed the same arc. So did New York. So the question is not why those cities were filthy. The question is, over the course of those 200 years, who was living in the mud? Who was being fined for having nowhere to put their waste? And who got to be called civilized by the time the story was over? The streets of New Amsterdam were eventually cleaned, slowly, over decades, as infrastructure was gradually built up around them. The city was renamed New York in 1664, when the English took control. And then it grew into one of the greatest urban centers in the history of the human race. But the smell of 1647 never truly went away. It simply changed form. Every time a modern city finds someone for illegal dumping, without providing enough public waste bins, every time a low-income neighborhood goes underserved by waste collection, while a wealthier one gets trucks rolling to the curb every morning, every time the narrative of civic responsibility is used to paper over the reality of infrastructure inequality, that smell drifts through again. History does not repeat itself exactly, but sometimes it lingers, buried just beneath newer language, more polished language. And if we don't learn to recognize the smell of it, there is a very real chance we are standing in the middle of our own version of it right now without even knowing it.